Blog Talk Radio.
Good evening. Welcome to The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn. And it is August 1st, 2018. Test. Nice. Comprehensive and progressive. Don't those sound like two great words? Oh, that sounds good. Those two words in front of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they just change the name. They don't do anything else. Nothing. Maybe that's better too. God damn it. Only on season 9. I'll get the hang of this shit yet. Don't worry. Did you think the TPP died when the United States withdrew? Did you think it would stay dead? Well, not by a long shot. The other 11 signatory nations treated the abandonment of the deal by President Drumpf to be merely a temporary circumstance. Carry on. Because, of course, there are plenty of industries and corporations that want their deal, especially the ones who have a presence and something to gain all around the Pacific Rim. Enter the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. New name, new acronym, same old deal. Out of more than 5,500 pages, a whopping 21 clauses are now excluded from the original TPP. That's it. The rest of it is still there with this new name slapped on it. But the only official reference to it as the CPTPP is in the agreement that the 11 nations signed in May in Santaigo, Chile. And what that cover letter basically says is, we, the undersigned 11, accept and endorse the original TPP, minus 21 clauses that were geared upon U.S. demands. We, the undersigned 11, added the words comprehensive and progressive to the title because it sounds cool and gives us a new name to sell the same garbage. We, the undersigned 11, are open to more nations joining in the future, including the U.S. But now we're calling the shots. That's pretty much all it says. Canadian industry lobby groups, the Conservatives, the Liberal government, all anticipating this retread deal flying through Parliament. Bill C-79 was tabled before the summer break, which will provide the necessary ratification of the agreement. But how come you're not hearing anything about it in the corporate media, really? Well, if you recall, 2 years ago, there were protests and organized opposition to this deal in all 12 nations. That's being avoided this time with the name change and not much coverage. Now, you will see coverage on what you could call the trade websites, For instance, the agriculture lobby is all for it. They always have been. You're going to see stuff from Canadian auto workers in Unifor about the dangers to industry. But, global, CTV, CBC, not much. Just, the press release when a bill comes out. That's about it. Nobody wants to talk about it because it faced a lot of heat last time. The rubber stamp is quietly being poised. It's been over 2 years since I did an episode on the TPP. That was season 4, episode 19, and that was with Megan Sally, who was with Open Media at the time. This is season 9, episode 12. So yeah, it's been a while. So we're going to go back and look at it again and discuss what, if anything, has changed besides the environment. Now, Canada talks a lot, it doesn't matter which government, about trade, need trade, gotta have trade. But to what end? It seems the opposition to these so-called free trade agreements is consistent because the deals are basically consistent. Every time there's a new deal, the government of the day proclaims it as long overdue and we need things like this. Well, doesn't Canada already have trade deals? Well, let's take a look, shall we? Okay, of course, the TPP is 11 nations. Canada, Australia, Brunei, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. The Pacific Rim. And this is a free trade agreement. Now, of course, despite current conditions, we are still a signatory to NAFTA, starting in 1994. One member of the TPP is in that agreement, Mexico. What else is Canada got? Well, there's a group called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Canada is in discussions for a free trade agreement with that group. Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam are also in that group. TISA, Trade in Services Agreement. This is global. This is bad news. It's not being talked about much these days, but it's out there and it's in negotiations. Who's in that from TPP? Australia, Chile, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru. So another deal with the same players. Canada and Chile have a free trade agreement already from 1997. Canada and Japan are negotiating a free trade agreement. Canada and the Pacific Alliance are negotiating a free trade agreement. Who's in the Pacific Alliance from TPP? Chile, Mexico, Peru. Speaking of Peru, Canada and Peru have a free trade agreement since 2009. Canada and Peru also have a Foreign Investment Protection agreement. Foreign Investment Protection Agreement. Just like, China FIPA? Yeah, we have one with Peru. That's from 2007. Why? Well, I don't know. Canadian mining, anyone? Canada and Singapore are negotiating a free trade agreement. And of course, there's the WTO, the Principal's Office. Canada is signatory to 7 agreements in force with WTO and in negotiation for one more. So it's not like we don't have shit going on. Now, as far as the CPTPP goes, since the agreement was signed in May, it's already ratified by 3 nations. Mexico, Got that done before the government changed. It's irrevocable now. Japan. New government there pounded it through. Singapore has approved it. Australia, New Zealand, Peru, and Chile are close. They're ahead of Canada. There's a lot of hype about the first 6 who ratify this agreement. As soon as 6, which is the majority of 11, or if somebody would happen to leave, a simple majority, whichever number is lower, once they pass it, it's on. The agricultural lobbies, especially in Canada, are hyping this, that Canada has to be in the first 6 because we have to get our agriculture and our beef and our pork to these markets before everybody else. Well, who's everybody else exactly? Australia doesn't have a beef industry like Canada does, or a pork industry. Singapore sure as hell doesn't. Japan doesn't. They're the market we want. Mexico? No, not really. How can it be cost effective for Mexico to ship their consumable meats all the way to the other side of the Pacific Ocean? They don't have to. They can sell it a lot closer to home. Lower overhead. Like I said, it's the same old TPP. That's all there is to it. There truly are no additions to the text except for removing the things that the U.S. stomped their feet for. And there are what they call side letters, which can allow exemptions between countries or one country against the group. Canada did receive an exemption for our culture, which we've had in every deal forever, so, whatever. But the first thing we're going to do, and I don't have any reports yet, but I hope it sounds okay. Yes, everybody knows what my pauses are. I'm checking social media. Oh, there's somebody in the chat. Wow, far out. Now think back to the first wave of TPP. It made a lot of stink. There was a lot of noise. And there were a lot of protests all around the Pacific Rim. And that was a big part of the show that we did more than 2 years ago. I'm going to go back and cover some of the feeling that was around that. And remember, this is the same damn deal that we're talking about now and everybody is just yawning about. Now, the TPP text, the 5,500 pages, was released in the first week of November 2015. And the first thing I'm going to turn to here is an article by Chris Hedges that was in TruthDig. And he said, TPP is the most brazen corporate power grab in American history. It's worse than any of us feared. Now, at this time, 2015, the TPP is part of a triad of trade agreements that includes the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, and the Trade and Services Agreement, TISA. Well, as soon as Brexit started to rear its head, TTIP got shelved. So that's gone, but TISA is still out there. Now, he comments on TISA. TISA calls for the privatization of all public services. It's a mortal threat to the viability of the U.S. Postal Service, public education, and other government-run enterprises and utilities. Together, these operations make up 80% of the U.S. economy. The TTIP and TISA are still in the negotiation phase. They will follow on the heels of the TPP. So there's been a definite slowdown in the time frame for global agreements over the last few years. Thank God. But Mr. Hedges goes on to say these three agreements solidify the creeping corporate coup d'etat, along with the final evisceration of national sovereignty. Citizens will be forced to give up control of their destiny and will be stripped of the ability to protect themselves from corporate predators, safeguard the ecosystem, and find redress and justice in our now anemic and often dysfunctional democratic institutions. The agreements, filled with jargon, convoluted technical trade and financial terms, legalese, fine print, and obtuse phrasing, can be summed up in two words: corporate enslavement. Now, of course, this is from a U.S. point of view, and the U.S. was the granddaddy of the deal. The TPP removes legislative authority from Congress and the White House on a range of issues. Judicial power is often surrendered to three-person trade tribunals, in which only corporations are permitted to sue. Workers, environmental groups, advocacy groups, and unions are blocked from seeking redress in the tribunals. The rights of corporations become sacrosanct. The rights of citizens are abolished. And that was from the U.S. He goes on to cover some other early opposition and outline some of the obvious ills and what it would cost. It says countries that have public healthcare systems, such as Canada and Australia, that are in the agreement will probably see their public health systems collapse under corporate assault. Corporations will be empowered to hold a wide variety of patents, including over plants and animals, turning basic necessities in the natural world into marketable products. And just to make sure corporations extract every pound of flesh, any public law interpreted by corporations as impeding projected profit, even a law designed to protect the environment or consumers, will be subject to challenge in the investor-state dispute settlement section. Another lovely part of these agreements. Mr. Hedges closes with, the agreement in essence becomes global law. Any agreements over carbon emissions by countries made through the United Nations are effectively rendered null and void by the TPP. There is more than enough evidence from past trade agreements to indicate where the TPP, often called NAFTA on steroids, will lead. It is part of the inexorable march by corporations to take from us the ability to use government to defend the public and to build social and political organizations that promote the common good. Of course, being Chris Hedges, it's certainly in character, but that's from the United States. What about up here? All right, well, let's turn to Murray Dobbin in the Tyee. This is January 22nd, 2016. There is now a large body of research and commentary exposing just how detrimental the TPP is to Canada's economy and democracy. But there has been little in the commentary that looks at the actual record of these deals, specifically the first one signed, NAFTA, and its predecessor, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Dobbin basically describes it as a race to the bottom over time. It depends on how much is surrendered to, have a bearing on how quickly that road goes. Of course, the Council of Canadians were giving warnings that this should not be ignored. And the numbers back it up, really. An ECOS poll commissioned by the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in October 2015 found that 41% of Canadians support the TPP, while 38% oppose it. Now, when specific questions are asked, the numbers go a different direction. Will TPP mean job losses in Canada? 61% say yes, 24% say no. Will it mean greater income inequality in Canada? 49% say yes, 30% say no. I don't understand how you could have such a large no decision for that question. It's yes or no. Will it mean environmental damage to Canada? 45% say yes, 36% say no. Will it mean higher wages in Canada? 72% say no, 11% say yes. These are the conditions that the Liberal government in 2016 signed on to TPP. Now, there are many specific reasons to Canada why it was bad for us. And I turn to the analysis that the Council of Canadians had at the time. Drug patents is a huge issue, extending them, locking in costs when clearly generics are warranted. This is a case where ISDS could most definitely be used. Say this could be happening in a country near you pretty soon. A government revokes patents on certain prescription drugs because the costs are simply too high for the need of that product. Well, if it's in TPP, that big pharma company can sue the government. Fun for all. More Canadian opinion. Jeremy Nuttall, also in Ataï. This was January 27, 2016. And he looked at some other opinions. Canadian Labour Congress President Hassan Youssef warned he has no idea how a major Pacific Rim trade deal will help Canadian workers. He said TPP would cost Canada thousands of jobs in the auto sector and pave the way for foreign firms to bring their own workers to Canada rather than hiring locals. He asked the minister at the time, Chrystia Freeland, for economic impact studies done by the former Conservative government. The Liberals said they couldn't find them. By all means, go sit at the table and hold up your pen, because we can't find the research. But it must be cool. All our friends are here. Investment arbitration experts are also not on board with TPP, saying it is a gift to corporations that strips countries of their sovereignty to make way for business. But then on the other side, proponents say it opens up economic opportunities. Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Unifor said Ottawa should also engage in full and open debate with Canadians, not just Parliament, before ratifying the deal. Of course, at that time, Minister Freeland said because, she went to a few work trailers and did a little tour and some pictures were taken and she wore boots. she's consulted. So everything's cool. But that didn't go over too well with some of the unions involved. United Steelworkers had a meeting with the minister and had a little bit of a different opinion of it. It should be clearly noted that in no way has the government ever consulted with our union on the TPP. Our union has attended 2 CLC-sponsored meetings, but in no conceivable way, unless you're a liberal, can this be taken as consultation. I like that. That's true. They do that with all things. All things. The best review that I saw that was section by section and was used on the show in season 4 was a series of short, concise articles by Professor Michael Geist that were published in Rabble. I'm just going to cover a few highlights because there are a lot of sections and there are a lot of problems. The e-commerce provisions were supposed to be a big deal in the TPP. Well, according to Mr. Geist, hang on. Okay, is this a message about the microphone? Apparently not. Okay, well, whatever. Okay, I'm going to try and turn it up a little bit and see if that makes a difference. I don't know if it will or not, but let me know. As part of the U.S. effort to drum up support for the TPP, remember, this is early 2016, President Barack Obama enlisted the support of eBay, sending an email to 600,000 merchants that claimed that the agreement would help its e-commerce and small e-stores. That message was repeated by the managing director of eBay Canada, who wrote an op-ed in the Financial Post that similarly pointed to the e-commerce rules, de minimis customs rules, and the benefits for small and medium-sized business. But the trouble with the TPP is that a closer look at the text reveals that the benefits from the e-commerce provisions, de minimis rules, and the much-touted SME chapter are practically non-existent. Article 14.6 of the TPP addresses the issues of electronic authentication and electronic signatures, key aspects of ensuring that e-commerce transactions are enforceable. The foundational issue, as found in many e-commerce laws, is that electronic signatures have the same validity as paper ones. In other words, unless a country rules otherwise, electronic signatures are valid. By providing for the flexibility to determine otherwise, the TPP gives business with no additional certainty to respect to electronic signatures, as it remains up to each country to develop its own rules. So there's no answer. This was supposed to be one of the things that was solved. It's not solved. Of all the things they could make a statute on and put it in the agreement that everybody follows, they couldn't do it with that. Not a help. Also remember the status of ICANN around this time too, with overall internet jurisdiction. The de minimis customs rules are of little help as well. The rules allow low-value shipments to proceed without further customs duties. The eBay Canada op-ed said that the de minimis threshold remains a key barrier to Canadian consumer and small business participation in the global economy. Well, how does the TPP address that? Well, the agreement says no customs duties will be assessed on express shipments valued at or below a fixed amount set under the parties' law. In other words, the TPP has no answer. Business as usual. Everybody can set their own rates. That's just one section. Now, this related to the cultural exemptions that Canada always gets. Again, from Michael Geist. The TPP departs from long-standing Canadian policy by not containing a full cultural exception and creates unprecedented restrictions on policies to support the creation of Canadian content. And that's what these culture exemptions are all about, Canadian content. The Canadian position on trade and culture has been consistent for decades, with successive governments requiring a full exemption for the cultural industries. That exemption, which is found in agreements like NAFTA and CETA, give the government full latitude to implement cultural policies to support the creation of Canadian content. Rather than include an exception chapter or provision, the TPP contains several annexes that identify non-conforming measures. This allows countries, including Canada, to list exceptions to specific TPP rules. Without an exception for the cultural industries, the rules banning local presence requirements and national treatment for service providers would place Canadian cultural rules at risk. Now, Annex 2 included a Canadian exception on the cultural industries. Now, the government said we have a full exclusion, everything's cool. That led to media coverage that said the same, but a closer look at the actual text reveals that Canada did not obtain a full cultural exception. A couple rules or a couple tools were taken away that they could use to enforce such decisions. So yeah, you can make the laws. We're just going to take two tools away from you to put them in place. This was a big deal when the Netflix tax was being talked about as a way to pay into a fund for Canadian content. This exemption would prevent a Netflix tax, ever. So you wonder why the government of the day lets the Netflix tax thing flare up and then, it's not happening and it goes away. It's not because of any decision made in Ottawa. Now, Mr. Geist asked why Canada departed from the long-standing standard regarding cultural policy. All he got was boilerplate. They pointed to the same two flawed exceptions. They don't explain the wording. They just tell you where the wording is. And if you don't like what it says, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you anymore. We're not going to talk about it. The trade secret law. Now, trade secret law is something that exists everywhere. It's in the WTO. It's in all kinds of things. And it's about intellectual property. But trade secrets don't fit in the way a lot of other things do. While rules for patents and copyright seek to strike a balance between rights and access, because a patent requires disclosure of the invention, and copyright grants the balancing of creator and user rights, but trade secrets don't involve any disclosure. And, you know, Mr. Geist says it only makes sense. Trade secrets must remain secret to constitute a trade secret. Most TPP countries provide civil remedies for unauthorized trade secret disclosures, so that if a company believes that there has been a violation, they must initiate a case before the courts to seek damages. The TPP dramatically changes trade secret law by also requiring criminal penalties, raising the specter of government prosecution for violations. It's no longer civil, it's criminal. Article 18.78, which is still in the new agreement, includes requirements for criminal penalties and procedures for trade secret violations. Now, this is something that the U.S. specifically lobbied for, to follow U.S. law. But the U.S. is no longer in this deal, but this is. You get the feeling that everybody's just waiting out the orange turd. Have you ever got the feeling? Now, Canada has its own coverage under the Security of Information Act. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce identified both Canada and Australia as examples of countries that it believes have weak remedies, procedural obstacles, and an insufficient deterrent under existing law. Now, the examples they used, they're pretty bad. Remember back in 2004 when it was WestJet stole passenger data from Air Canada? The way things are now in Canada, that's not economic espionage. It doesn't meet the standard. But it certainly would under TPP. And I see another offshoot of this, just as the CFAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States, remains so archaic and ill-conceived, the onus is on the perpetrator. If they get caught, they get charged 1,000 times over, at least, of any so-called damage done to their targets. There's absolutely no incentive for corporations or anything else to improve their operational security, to have competent people, and don't use equipment that's 20 years old. Laws like this allow corporations to not maintain their IT infrastructures. And this all started with the Sony hack, so it's here. Mr. Geis goes on, the troubling link between healthcare and intellectual property in the TPP. Now, Chapter 8 of the TPP covers technical barriers to trade, and it contains some surprising restrictions on the ability for national regulators to require the disclosure of certain information as part of the regulatory review process for pharmaceutical products and medical devices. Now, according to the Canadian government Sunny Way's fact sheet, the summary of Chapter 8 does not disclose that there are data collection restrictions. In fact, the only reference to the issue states that the chapter improves regulatory transparency in the areas of cosmetics, medical devices, and pharmaceutical products. But Mr. Geis says it does far more than address regulatory transparency. Annex 8C.7 requires each party to make its determination on whether to grant marketing authorization specific pharmaceutical product on the basis of factors such as clinical data, manufacturing quality, and labeling information. But it also says that no party, which means the nations, no party shall require sale or related financial data concerning the marketing of the product as part of such a determination. Further, each party shall endeavor not to require pricing data as part of the determination. So, Health Canada is not allowed to ask how much money you guys are spending on advertising and how much money are you spending on research and development. No, you don't need to know that. Just here's our clinical data. But we can't tell you how much we spent on this clinical trial and who did it. Okay. Medical devices is the same thing. It is not clear why the Canadian government has made agreement to these limitations, nor why the summary documents do not reference them. This information could assist regulators in making better decisions on medical devices and pharmaceutical products, yet the TPP will inexplicably block them from doing so. Well, that's awesome. See, and I said I just never get around to checking the chat. So now I went back to the chat. I got a second before the next article. Okay. There. Hi. What's this? No, don't care. Okay, back to the show. Now, the TPP locks in protection for biologics and puts global health at risk. That's the headline on this one from Michael Geist. Now, as the negotiations reached their conclusion in Atlanta in October 2015, one outstanding issue stood above all others: protection for biologics. While not well understood by the public, at issue was billions of dollars and access to cutting-edge medicines. Biological drugs are pharmaceuticals involving complex molecules or mixtures of molecules that are made of biological sources manufactured within a living system. They differ from conventional drugs that are manufactured by combining chemical ingredients. Building on greater knowledge of genetics and cell processes, the area represents a major growth area for the pharmaceutical industry. With the complexity comes cost, with biological drugs far more expensive than conventional ones. Much like the generic pharmaceutical industry creates cheaper generic versions of chemical drugs, companies have begun to create biosimilars as cheaper versions of biological drugs, relying on data from clinical trials to formulate the alternative. Pharmaceutical companies have sought protection of that data. Now, as a relatively new area with billions at stake, countries have adopted a wide range of approaches to the issue of data protection. The U.S. currently offers 12 years. And recently sought to reduce the term to 7 years. Now, the thing is, when countries set these limits that no data is allowed to be disseminated to even allow a generic to be made, if the government is buying that medication through its social services, it's forcing itself to pay a higher price. It's funny how that works, eh? Well, in the TPP, Article 18.52 provides for at least 8 years of protection, or 5 years of protection plus other measures to provide comparable outcome in the market. The ongoing dispute over this section on what the provision means is the source of some of the opposition to the TPP in the U.S., Canada currently meets the 8-year standard, so no further changes would be required. Now, there was a study done that concluded it is far from clear that any protection is needed, given market incentives and the protections that may be granted through patents. The TPP locks in protection, making it difficult for any TPP country to later amend its rules. That binding policy, which comes at a still early stage of new technical development, may create long-term health costs to the detriment of patients, innovation, and marketplace competition. So why are all the conservatives so in favor of it? Patent term extensions are likely to increase healthcare costs for Canadians. The TPP patent provision changes are very significant since they lock Canada into extending the term of patent protection, which will ultimately increase healthcare costs. Global organizations such as MSF, Doctors Without Borders, has warned that the agreement will raise the price of medicines for millions of people, particularly in the developing world. Now, when the Conservatives were asked about this, while they were still government, they compared it to CETA. Mr. Geist calls that a sleight of hand. Now, the changes in CETA, which the government admitted would result in increased healthcare costs, they're not part of current Canadian law. And they're not part of any bill that at that time had been introduced before the House. So it's something that was approved but hadn't come into effect because Europe has to approve it. But it's approved here. We're ready. Gimme, gimme. So just because it's not on the books yet, the Conservatives say, oh, no. Not happening. The TPP requires several significant changes to Canadian patent law. The Canadian government believes that the CETA agreement, 2-year patent restoration provision, will meet the requirement of TPP. The effect of that is therefore to take CETA's patent Wow, hang on, gonna have something to drink. Nothing like doing a live show. The effect of the TPP is therefore to lock in CETA's patent restoration extension, even if CETA is never ratified or never implemented. According to one study, the impact of these provisions in CETA could lead to increased drug costs of between $850 million and $1.6 billion annually. In fact, the TPP expands the extension requirements beyond those found in CETA. Article 18.46 requires a patent term adjustment due to patent office delays. Now, why is this happening now? The escalation in patent protections is set to occur just as drug prices hit all-time highs in Canada, and pharmaceutical investment in research and development sinks to decade-long lows. Those results come from a report released by the Patent Medicines Panel Review Board, an independent body charged by the government to track patent medicines pricing and spending, alongside investment in research and development by Big Pharma. The report indicates that Canadians pay more for patented drugs than consumers in France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Sweden, and Switzerland. Only the US and Germany pay more among countries in the study. In 2005, Canadian prices were, on average, approximately equal to or below corresponding prices other than Italy. By 2014, Canadian prices were decidedly above prices in all the countries I mentioned. Over the past 12 years, Canadian expenditures on drugs has outpaced all other comparator countries, including the US. A 184.4% growth in total drug expenditures in 12 years. Not only has Canadian expenditures on drugs been high, but the ratio of sales to R&D in Canada has fallen to record lows. In the 1980s, the Mulroney government, Big Pharma lobbied for patent reforms that provided new rights and longer protections. In return, it promised to increase spending on research and development in Canada so that it would rise to 10% of total sales by 1996. The ratio is now at 4.4%, the lowest since 1988. The peak was 11.7 in 1995. So they got a big one in right before they set that benchmark, and then, yeah, I'll talk to you later. In countries such as the United Kingdom and France, drug prices are lower and research expenditures are far higher. Things getting more expensive. But free trade. Now I'm going to turn to something that came from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. This was back in early 2016 as well. And it says, Trans-Pacific Partnership hides significant health costs, according to two new studies. One study from the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, reveals significant risks and high public costs to the Canadian healthcare system. The second study, Major Complications, the TPP and Canadian Healthcare. The TPP includes many new rights for U.S. and Japanese drug companies to comment on, review, and appeal Canadian regulatory decisions, which could adversely affect drug approvals and safety. Faster regulatory approvals of medicines, which might result from the TPP, have been shown to lead to a higher incidence of safety problems, including warnings and withdrawals. The TPP's carve-out provision for tobacco control measures will not provide meaningful protection for future Canadian plain packaging rules, since U.S.-based tobacco companies will continue to have access to NAFTA's investor state protections. Other forms of public health regulation, from controls on trans fats to regulating legalized marijuana, are fully exposed to lawsuits from disgruntled foreign investors. And the TPP Financial Services chapter actually makes it easier for foreign insurers to challenge the expansion of public health insurance into new areas by allowing ISDS, involving a much abused minimum standards of treatment rule. I'm just always impressed by all these government releases about how free trade is opening up the world. Oh, it is. It's allowing the world to go around our laws that we thought were there for reasons. Silly us. Now, just to back that up, what was said there about patents. There was an article that came out April 27th, 2018 in the Huffington Post by Raiza Patel, and it did a little bit of a follow-up on what was being talked about there. The Canada-EU trade deal will cost Canadians hundreds of millions of dollars in extra drug costs. Who come up with this one? The Parliamentary Budget Officer. An extension of drug patent protections in the CETA, Canada-EU Free Trade Deal, could end up costing Canadians an estimated $392 million a year, and federal coffers up to $270 million of that more annually. Federal legislation that enacted CETA added 2 years to the existing 20-year patent protections for drugs containing new medicinal ingredients, which accounted for about 1/3 of all patented drugs sold in 2015. As a result, drug companies now enjoy a 22-year period of market exclusivity for eligible drugs before cheaper generic versions can be produced and sold. The estimated figures based on 2015 data, which was exactly the period Mr. Geist was referring to, is meant to provide an illustrative analysis to study the potential impact of just the 2-year extension. None of the drugs on the market were eligible for the extension when it was granted last year. So, one big bang at the start, with costs built in for 22 years. Hell of a good idea. As I said on the show, back when it was relevant, there's only one thing I wanted from Trump, and that was to get out of TPP. He did. Didn't care why. I thought that would kill it. Boy, was I wrong. But the loss of the number one economy in the world has basically cut what is now the TPP 11 in half. It's still a very large trading bloc, still a decent-sized population bloc. But remember that Japan is the number 3 economy in the world. So there's still some weight there. The Trudeau government didn't make a lot of noise about this being started back up. It's just like, oh, well, we already signed it, so, we're just being, courteous. We're going to go check it out. Of course, the media made issues over very small events as this process kept going. One incident in Japan comes to mind. But there was no doubt that Canada would stay in. They have a new cultural exemption. I believe it is no better than the old one. As I said in the opening, the TPP is the deal. There is no new deal. There was no renegotiation. There was no opening. Right now, Malaysia, with the change in government and the arrest of a lot of the old government on a various amount and type of financial crime, the new government in Malaysia is saying that they may have to review. They may ask to open the agreement. This is another reason that the first 6 thing is such a big deal. This is what you're not going to hear from any government spokesman. They're just going to say, well, we ourselves, we need this trade deal. We want it hammered through. What they're not going to say is, well, Malaysia could ask to have it opened up. And if it's not in effect by then we're going to have to wait. That's what they're trying to avoid. However, it's back. We started to hear noise about it. A little more than, well, a year ago, I guess. Now, there are definitely people on the yes side, as I said, and people on the no side. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to figure out who's on which side. It's pretty much your usual lineup. But the method of sale from either side has advanced from last time. It's much more nuanced. It's much more glossy. Now, the first thing I'm going to go to here is from the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. Of course, they are completely in favor of this deal, no matter what it's called. Negotiations for the CPTPP concluded on January 23rd, 2018 in Tokyo, and includes much of the original content of the TPP. Yeah, 99.5% is much of the original content. It was signed on March 8th at a ceremony in Santiago. It was attended by then International Trade Minister François-Philippe Champagne and the 10 other trade ministers. This agreement secures access to a region which has a combined gross domestic product of $13.5 trillion, and once implemented will make Canada the only G7 country with free trade access to the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Total bilateral trade between Canada and the TPP region amounted to $105 billion in 2016, which is 8.1% of Canada's total trade. In particular, the CPTP retains the same rules and market access outcomes and most of the provisions of the TPP. Yeah, no kidding. This includes the reduction of tariffs that is expected to result in savings of $428 million a year for Canadians. No definition of Canadians. Further, 21 provisions have been suspended or changed, largely in areas which were priorities for the United States, such as investment and intellectual property. Once it enters into force, it will be one of the largest free trade agreements in the world, with 11 countries representing almost 500 million people and a combined GDP of 13.5% of the global gross domestic product. The gains will benefit many sectors, including financial services, fish and seafood, metals and minerals, and agri-food. They go on to go through all the tariffs that will be eliminated for their industry. In 2017, Canada exported about $8 billion in agri-food to the TPP region. This agreement will provide unprecedented and preferential access to large and fast-growing markets in the Asia Pacific. And Japan will eliminate so much tariffs, and Vietnam and Malaysia, well, maybe. Now, this, of course, is expected to boost Canadian sales because all of a sudden the U.S. are boogeymen. For canola, better trade security, more value for the products, and increased exports by up to $780 million a year. For pork producers, preferential access ahead of non-TPP competitors, ability to compete in the billion-dollar Japanese market, where exports could climb by $300 million. Canadian beef producers expect to double or triple annual exports to Japan to nearly 300 million. Well, there was no problem with beef exports to Japan until Mad Cow. Because, there was so much inspection going on with that government. Canadian barley producers could export an additional 400,000 to 500,000 tons of barley in various value-added forms worth about 100 million. So, of course, these guys are all for it. Japan, Malaysia, and Vietnam are regarded as the key markets where Canadian exporters currently face high tariffs and no preferential access. So we're on the same playing field as everybody else, and that's just not acceptable. Japan is expected to account for 93% of agri-food export gains. Japan has a population of 127 million and is the fourth largest importer of agri-food products in the world, and already Canada's third largest market for the same. Canada's main competition for the Japanese agri-food market includes the United States, China, Thailand, Australia, and the EU. Now, what about Vietnam? A new player, a new tiger. Vietnam's population reached about 95 million in 2017 and is currently Canada's 13th largest agri-food export market. They have an exploding middle class. The annual growth rate in Vietnam averaged 6.5% over 2000 to 2018. PricewaterhouseCoopers say that Vietnam is likely the world's fastest growing economy. Top Canadian exports to Vietnam include wheat, soybeans, canola meal, and pulses. Malaysia has 31 million people. Exports to Malaysia include soybeans, wheat flour, canola oil, and frozen processed French fries. Now, there is one free trade agreement in place between Canada and a country in this area, and it's with South Korea, 2015. Of course, much benefit was touted. Very little has shown up. Surprise, surprise. But that's the word from industry. Now I turn to Kelvin Hepner in Real Agriculture. This is from June 14th this year. Legislation required to implement the TPP was tabled in the House of Commons. And of course, the standard boilerplate from the government minister. The momentum of our progressive trade agenda continues with this next important step on CPTPP. We negotiated the best deal for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And this agreement will benefit industries across Canada, from beef and barley to forestry products, seafood, manufacturing, and services, said Trade Minister François-Philippe Champagne in a statement after introducing Bill C-79. Well, Minister, what exactly did you negotiate? Negotiations were closed when your government came in. What exactly did you negotiate? Here's a hint. Le squat. It's going to increase manufacturing in Canada by having all these Asian Rim countries in there with far more workforce than we have. Oh. Now, Mexico has already ratified the deal in April of this year. Japan did at the end of June, and Singapore has ratified in July. The race for the first 6 is on. The first mover advantage is real in trade deals, and Canada cannot afford to be left behind our competitors. Thousands of jobs and billions in agri-food exports are at stake. It's imperative that our parliamentarians come together and act swiftly to get this done. Yeah, in other words, hey, this is for us. We really like this. Would you guys just sign it? Well, you mean you have to debate and shit? Come on, just sign it. We gave your party money. Now let's look at the no side. Since the signing of the new CPTPP. This is by Duncan Roden at a Green Left, which is an Australian outfit. With the release of the full text of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership on February 21st of 2018, activists in the 11 signatory countries finally got to see if their worst fears for a corporate power grab would be confirmed. Unfortunately, they mostly were. Now, first, here's a bit of a no point of view from Australia. After the text release, Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network convener, Dr. Patricia Ranald, said many of the most harmful clauses remain. In particular, ISDS remains in the deal. Out of New Zealand, New Zealand Council of Trade Unions economist Bill Rosenberg said, citizens risk losing our ability to use government purchasing and our state-owned enterprises for the public good. The documents released by the government today do not have an independent analysis of the health and environmental risks. Neither do they have anything to say about who gains and who loses, the impacts on inequality. From Canada, President of Unifor, Jerry Dias, said Ontario is acknowledging that the CPTPP is a job killer and is asking for measures to offset the known damage that it will inflict. Rather than covering the wound, it should be seeking to prevent the injury by calling for an exemption for auto, or better yet, pushing to prevent ratification. Unifor said trade agreements must serve to enhance our collective economic and social development and must be guided by progressive fair trade principles. Well, come on, Jerry. They put progressive in the title. You think they're lying? Back to Australia. Scott Connolly said, this is a bad deal for working people and a win for corporate power. It lets companies exploit temporary workers. The Turnbull government must stop trading away our jobs, wages, and opportunities for corporate profits. Japan, of course, had a little different tune. The Japanese government, among others, is concerned that ratification could be a long and difficult struggle. In Japan's case, the original TPP was opposed by all opposition parties except one. They expect the same difficulty this time, as the final CPTPP is not that different. In a sign of the public pressure governments are under, Nikkei Asian Review quoted a source close to the Japanese government saying, the new administrations in Canada and New Zealand won the public over on the CPTPP by saying the agreement is different from the original version. Having them go back and approve the original version represents a high political hurdle. I wonder if I have a sound effect that fits for that. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? A member anonymously from the Japanese delegation says flat out that it was sold as a new deal to Canada and Australia, and it's not at all. Did we hear that? And of course, this coming from a publication in Australia. So there's some of your no. What about here at home? With the text came out in March, and the signing in May, and the C-79 hit the floor right before the House rose. Council of Canadians calls on the Trudeau government to scrap the TPP. They're just calling it the TPP because it is. They have a prepared statement from Brent Patterson. The Council of Canadians has numerous concerns about the so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, this was put out on March 9th, the day after the signing of the agreement. Largely the same as the TPP. Again, Japan's chief negotiator for the deal, Kazuyoshi Umemoto, says one of the main reasons to keep the differences between the original TPP 12 and TPP 11 to a minimum is to induce the U.S. to come back to the deal. Now, the removal of provisions that everybody's been talking about, because there's nothing else to say that sets it apart. Listen carefully. Provisions in the original deal, including patent provisions on pharmaceutical drugs that would increase the costs for those who need to access them, while boosting the profits of the transnational corporations that make them, were only suspended, not deleted, not removed, which leaves the door open for them to return. So even these 21 clauses that were just for the U.S., they're still in the agreement. There's just something added that says, oh, these are suspended until we say otherwise. Public consultation ignored. In April 2017, the Liberal-controlled House Standing Committee on International Trade issued its report on TPP, concluding the federal government should pursue a deal. The dissenting opinion by the NDP members notes, despite the committee's study being called a public consultation, the committee's report gives little attention to the input provided by members of the public. It is worth noting that every individual who spoke at the public participation sessions expressed concerns with the TPP and in most cases opposed the agreement outright. Sunny ways, always sunny ways, friends. ISDS remains. The New Zealand government's national interest analysis of the TPP includes a section on potential disadvantages to New Zealand, including around the controversial ISDS clause. New Zealand and Australia have signed a side letter which will stop investors from both countries suing under ISDS. New Zealand's Trade Minister David Parker acknowledges ISDS has not disappeared from the agreement. Minimal gains versus large risks and job loss. Now, according to the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, even the rosiest economic projections of the CPTPP come up with only tiny economic gains. A 0.082% increase in Canadian GDP by 2035. This represents a one-time increase after 15 years, not an annual increase. In January of 2016, a Tufts university study found that the original TPP would cost Canada 58,000 jobs and increase income equality. There's aspirational text in the preamble, the actual 3 pages that are CP in this agreement, but there's no binding rights. The Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network says the additional published text is only 9 pages, with some changes from Canada to the non-binding preamble that mention cultural identity, Indigenous rights, and gender equality. But these are aspirational only and will not affect the legally binding provisions in the rest of the agreement. Despite it being on the paper and them saying, look, we got it, it doesn't mean anything. This is like Munich. Like, what is this? In closing, it says the Trudeau government's comprehensive and progressive TPP is largely the same TPP the Conservative government under Stephen Harper signed in 2015. The Liberals have ignored the thousands of people who participated in their public consultation, and while touted as progressive, the deal includes the controversial ISDS mechanism. There will be job losses. There will be greater inequality in Canada and around member nations, and it does not protect the rights of women or Indigenous peoples. Council of Canadians calls on the government to not ratify. This is from June 18th. This is something that I just got wind of very recently. This is from Australia by Glenn Moody. It's on TechDirt. Now, the Open Source Industry Australia says the zombie TPP could destroy free software licensing. The Australian Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade is currently conducting an inquiry into TPP 11, step towards ratification by Australia. However, in its submission to the committee, Open Source Industry Australia warns that provisions in TPP 11's electronic commerce chapter have the potential to destroy the Australian free and open source software sector altogether. This is known as FOSS. And they call on the Australian government not to ratify the deal. The problem lies in Article 14.17. No party shall require the transfer of or access to source code of software owned by a person of another party as a condition for the import, distribution, sale, or use of such software or of products containing such software in its territory. What that says in English is if somebody doesn't want to give you source code, they don't have to. In its submission to the committee, the OSIA writes, Article 14.17 of the agreement prohibits requirements for transfer or access to the source code of computer software. While it does contain some exceptions, those are very narrow and appear rather carelessly worded in places. The exception that the organization has up in arms covers the inclusion of terms and conditions related to the provision of source code in commercially negotiated contracts. Now, if Australia ratifies the TPP, much will turn on whether the courts interpret the term commercially negotiated contracts as including the FOSS licenses all the time, some of the time, or none of the time. If the Australian courts rule that open source licenses are not commercially negotiated contracts, those licenses will no longer be enforceable in Australia, and free software as we know it will probably no longer exist there. The wording of Article 14.17 makes it unclear whether authors could still seek injunctions to enforce compliance with license terms requiring transfer of source code in cases where their copyright has been infringed. So without the ability to enforce compliance through the use of injunctions, open source licenses would once again be pointless. It's worth remembering why this particular article is present in the TPP. It grew out of concerns that nations like China and Russia were demanding access to source code as a prerequisite of allowing Western software companies to operate in their countries. Article 14.17 was designed as a bulwark against such demands. It's unlikely that it was intended to destroy open source licensing too, although some spotted early on that this was a risk. And doubtless a few big software companies will be only too happy to see free software undermined in this way. Another side effect that you're not going to find on your TV. Imagine no more free software because of a free trade agreement. Wow. Well, now I'm going to move on to specifically here in Canada, what was signed, what the government said, and Bill C-79. There's not a whole lot to it because, like I said, this is a new dress on the TPP pig. That's all it is. March 8th, 2018. This little blurb here, at 100%, it prints out to less than 10 pages. This is the CPTPP. The 5,500 pages underneath it is the TPP. This is the agreement that was signed. The parties to this agreement, resolving to reaffirm the matters embodied in the preamble to the TPP, done at Auckland on February 4th, 2016. There it is. Realize expeditiously the benefits of the TPP through this agreement and their strategic and economic significance. Contribute to maintaining open markets, increasing world trade, and creating new economic opportunities for people of all incomes and economic backgrounds. Promote further regional economic integration and cooperation between them. Enhance opportunities for the acceleration of regional trade, liberalization, and investment. Reaffirm the importance of promoting corporate social responsibility, cultural identity and diversity, environmental protection and conservation, gender equality, indigenous rights, labor rights, inclusive trade, sustainable development and traditional knowledge, as well as the importance of preserving their right to regulate in the public interest. Notice the first word of that high and mighty paragraph. Reaffirm. Reaffirm don't involve no laws. Reaffirm don't involve no rules. It's just a cool word. Yeah, we reaffirm that. Yeah, those are things. Yeah, we reaffirm the things. And welcome the accession of other states to this agreement. Article 1, incorporation of the TPP. That's Article 1 of the CPTPP is incorporation of the original agreement. Article 2, suspension of the application of certain provisions. These are the side letters and such, with exemptions. And they will remain in effect until they all get together and decide to end them or not. That's all that says. Article 3, entry into force. This agreement shall enter into force 60 days after the date on which at least 6 of the 11, or at least 50% of the number of signatories to the agreement, whichever is smaller, have notified the depositary in writing of the completion of their applicable legal procedures. So if one nation leaves, it's still 6, because 5 is not a majority of 10. Or, well, that's not true. 5 out of 10 would get it done. I'm sorry. At least 50%. Nice one. So Malaysia can get pissed off and leave, and it'll still happen. So once the first 6 get in their evidence to the depositary, which is in New Zealand for this agreement, 60 days, game on. Anybody who gets their shit done after those 60 days, as soon as they inform the depositary, sorry, that was a Freudian slip, 60 days after they give evidence. Article 4, withdrawal. Any party may withdraw from this agreement by providing written notice of withdrawal to the depositary. A withdrawing party shall simultaneously notify the other parties of its withdrawal. A withdrawal shall take effect 6 months after a party provides written notice, unless the parties agree on a different period. If a party withdraws, this agreement shall remain in force for the remaining parties. Article 5, accession. Any state or separate customs territory may accede to this agreement, subject to such terms and conditions as may be agreed between the parties and that state or separate customs territory. Article 6, review of the agreement. Further to Article 27.2, which is functions of the Commission, in the TPP, if the entry into force is imminent, or if the TPP is unlikely to enter into force, the party shall, on request of a party, review the operation of this agreement so as to consider any amendment to this agreement and any related matters. That is our get-out-of-jail-free card. If one country is going to reject it based on something specific, oh yeah, we can get together. We can work that out. What do you need to sell it at home? Oh yeah, sure, we can do that. No problem. That's all the comprehensive and progressive part of this deal is. That's it. Some boilerplate, some whole cards, some get-out-of-jail-free action. All is well. Remain calm. Sign the paper. After that signing, the statement by Minister Champagne. In Santaigo today, I was honored to represent Canada at the historic signing of the CPTPP agreement with all 11 member countries. Canada is very proud to be a part of this achievement. Canadian workers, producers, farmers, entrepreneurs, and businesses of all sizes will benefit from the CPTPP, which will diversify our export markets, strengthen our ties with the Asia-Pacific region, and create good jobs at home. Canada successfully improved the terms of this deal in the best interests of Canadians. This includes achieving important outcomes on intellectual property, an ISDS settlement mechanism, and other provisions of concern to Canadian stakeholders. For the first time, the environment and labor chapters are also enforceable under the agreement's FTA dispute settlement mechanism. In addition, Canada secured side letters on motor vehicles and culture that carry the full force of international law. Okay. Now you know why these guys are ministers. Talk about spin some shit. Yeah, there are important outcomes on intellectual property, and that's because the U.S. is gone and they removed the clauses. It had nothing to do with renegotiation. The minister claims ISTS is something that Canadians wanted, apparently, and the environment and labor chapters are enforceable under ISTS. Unions can't bring in action. Citizen groups can't bring in action. Industries in your country cannot bring in action. Only other parties can sue you. So Canada could be sued over a labor dispute. Sure, a good thing environment and labor chapters are included. Wow. Awesome. I believe it was on June 12th, might have been June 14th, the Liberal government introduced legislation to ratify a free trade deal with 10 other Pacific nations that it says would see Canada get preferential access to some of the biggest and fastest growing economies in the Asia-Pacific region. This is from CBC, Livon Savants. This article came out on June 14th. In 2017, Canada's merchandise trade with the 10 other countries amounted to more than $95 billion. The government claims that once the trade deal enters into force for Canada, it's expected to boost the country's GDP by $4.2 billion. Well, 95, 4.2, peanuts. For the risks and the corporate governance for 5%, I quote the Prime Minister, trade deals like the CPTPP open up new markets around the world for Canadian businesses and will create good middle-class jobs. With Bill C-79, the CPTPP will benefit Canadians and grow our economy for years to come. Oh my God. Conservative MP Dean Allison, the party's international trade critic, said the Liberals can count on the support of the Tories to quickly ratify the deal. Allison acknowledged that the deal has faced opposition in certain sectors of the Canadian economy, especially in the automotive and auto parts industries and among labor groups. There is definitely huge advantages for farmers and a number of other individuals that will be able to take advantage if we're able to ratify it first. There have been a number of sectors in the agricultural business in particular that have been encouraging us to move forward. And given all the uncertainty over Canada's trade relations with the United States and the European Union, it's a good time to try to diversify the country's trade. We already did $95 billion with them. We know who they are. They know who we are. Allison said the Tories will do everything in their power to speed up the ratification process in the hopes of passing the legislation before the House rises for the summer. Yeah, well, didn't happen. New Democrat MP Tracy Ramsey, the party's international trade critic, said while proponents of the TPP 11 argue that it will diversify Canada's trade, in the face of uncertainty over the fate of NAFTA, the trade agreement runs a very serious risk of complicating the already difficult NAFTA negotiations. In particular, the threats that were under NAFTA around supply management and around the auto sector. This particular deal is already very harmful to those two sectors, and they're facing potentially the greatest uncertainty that they've ever faced in terms of their trading relationship with our largest trading partner, the U.S., but ultimately the world. Despite the rebranding of the TPP with the addition of the words comprehensive and progressive to the original title, there is nothing particularly progressive about the deal, Ramsey said. There is no gender chapter. There is no consent from the Aboriginal people in Canada. The labor provisions themselves have been called toothless. They've been called weak. The agreement doesn't even use the word climate change. That's how environmentally weak it is. So, pretty clear it was on partisan lines. Now, what exactly is in Bill C-79? Well, like I said, it ain't long. Well, it's long because there's pages of schedules that just say this tariff will go from this to this. Just pages and pages. The actual meat of the bill is very short, just like the comprehensive and progressive part. I will read from the bill itself. Summary of the bill. This enactment implements the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, signed at Santaigo on March 8, 2018. The general provisions of the enactment set out rules of interpretation and specify that no recourse is to be taken on the basis of sections 9 to 13 or any order made under those sections or on the basis of the provisions of the agreement without the consent of the Attorney General of Canada. So that means no jumping the gun. Part 1 approves the agreement, provides for the payment by Canada of its share of the expenditures associated with the operation of the institutional and administrative aspects of the agreement, and gives the Governor and Council the power to make orders in accordance with the agreement. Again, I just want to point this out. Governor and Council, orders. These are not laws that are debated. These are cabinet orders. The cabinet, the Privy Council, will control Canada's compliance with this deal and make any changes. They don't have to go before the House. Part 2 amends certain acts to bring them into conformity with Canada's obligations under the agreement. And Part 3 contains coordinating amendments and the coming into force provision. This act will amend the Export and Import Permits Act, the Financial Administration Act, the Trademarks Act, the Investment Canada Act, the Customs Act, the Commercial Arbitration Act, the Canadian International Trade Tribunal Act, and customs tariffs. The transitional provision will apply to the Investment Canada Act. Now, the purpose of this act, as laid out in the bill. The purpose of this act is to implement the agreement, the objectives of which, as elaborated more specifically through its provisions, are to establish a free trade area in accordance with the agreement, promote, through the expansion of reciprocal trade, the harmonious development of the economic relations between Canada and the other parties to the agreement in order to create opportunities for economic development, promote conditions of fair competition affecting trade between Canada and other parties to the agreement. No rules, just conditions. Substantially increased investment opportunities between Canada and other parties to the agreement, while preserving the right of each of the parties to regulate to achieve legitimate policy goals. Yeah, because we've got ISDS. Make whatever law you want. Eliminate barriers to trade in goods and services in order to contribute to the harmonious development and expansion of world and regional trade, and seek to ensure that the benefits and opportunities created by the agreement are widely shared. Enhance and enforce environmental laws and regulations, and strengthen cooperation between Canada and other parties to the agreement on environmental matters. Protect, enhance, and enforce basic workers' rights. Strengthen cooperation on labor matters, and build on the respective international commitments of Canada and other parties to the agreement on labor matters. Recognize the importance of promoting corporate social responsibility, cultural identity and diversity, gender equality, the rights of Indigenous peoples, inclusive trade, and sustainable development. Whoa. Here, 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 here. Oh. Let me hit my table here. Okay, I'm going to be honest here. Big fucking deal. All talk. Nothing to make it happen. Just, I have a dream. That's what we're in for. With this parliament, you know it's going to fly through. Is the Senate going to do anything to it? Well, what the hell can they do? The parliament cannot open the agreement in parliament. They have to lobby the TPP to open it. So they can't amend it. So what are they going to do? Vote yes, vote no. You think the Senate of Canada is going to vote this down? Doubt that. This will be one of the first things talked about when the House comes back after the summer break. Bill C-79. Especially if more nations continue to get it approved before then. Because we're looking at mid-September. Easily. Could be the end of September. Could be October. Will there be 6 by then? Most likely. So what? That doesn't matter. You know? It doesn't matter. Like it says. If you're one of the first 6, say you're number 6. Well, then it comes into effect no faster than if you're number 8. So why don't they say they're all horny to be in the first 4? Doesn't make any sense. Whatever. This is what we're up against. This is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's nothing comprehensive about it. There's nothing progressive about it. It's a cover letter on the same old resume. 2 more shows before vacation for your host. No, I don't know who will be on them. Could be lots of guests. We'll see what happens. Can't count out current events. Shit always happens. But that's it on the TPP 11, which is what it is. I encourage you to call it that. It's comprehensive and progressive is just bullshit. That's the review. That's what we're looking at. Think about how it's going to affect NAFTA. It's another reason I think that people should not be excited about Mexico and the U.S. meeting on NAFTA with no Canada. Everybody knows Mexico's already approved TPP 11. And both Canada and Mexico have said NAFTA will be a 3-nation deal or no deal. So relax. Try and find some real news instead of making up horse shit. DCE. Shaw. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. See you next week on The View Up Here. Good night.